Hi, my name is Roger Clark, and I'm your host for today's episode of the Fourscore and Seven Project. Today, our discussion is about leadership and communications in the United States of America with a focus on politics and leadership. We're fortunate to have with us for a visit Professor Dan Schnur, who was with us in an earlier episode. And just to remind you that Professor Schnur is a professor at the Annenberg School of Communications at the University of Southern California, also a professor at Pepperdine
at the Graduate School of Public Policy.
Graduate School of and also a professor at University of California at Berkeley, where you teach communications, leadership, and politics.
Exactly right.
And you're also well published as well. I think your materials appeared in the LA Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and the Washington Post. So you have all the big papers covered for the most part.
Well, I appreciate you having me. I loved our first conversation, Roger. I'm really excited about this one.
Well, so am I. And I want to follow up on that because when we ended our first conversation, we were talking about the challenge that modern communications technology presents, meaning specifically that because of the algorithms that the big tech uses, that we recycle the same issues. If, say, for example, I'm interested in a particular point of view, big tech knows that, and it just feeds me more of the same, and it's a steady diet. I don't get any conflicting or contradictory post that represents a different point of view. And the net result is that we are separated as a people, and we question how people who don't agree with us, how they could possibly think that way. So that raises the question about communications. You are a professor of communications. Let's start this off. How can we overcome something that is creating tremendous division in this country because of that type of high-tech dilemma?
I think one of the things we have found that's changed, not just in politics, but in the private sector, in every aspect of society, is how much more difficult it is to communicate with a large audience when different members of that audience are getting their information from different places. The era of 3 television newscasters delivering the news to the rest of the country has been gone for some time now. And in its absence, in the absence of that more centralized communications mechanism, we now have such a fractured environment that communicating, just simply being heard by most of the population, let alone convincing them, is harder than ever. And I will tell you, I think the private sector is ahead of the political world on this, although campaigns are catching up. And the private sector marketing, they use a term called viral marketing. And while the private companies, the companies selling cars and toothpaste and cereal and so on, they still run ads that they hope everyone will see or hear. More and more they rely on the term of art as influencers. They rely on their customers to carry their message for them to their own circles. And so instead of everyone seeing the same TV commercial at the same time, that message gets delivered in dozens, if not hundreds, if not thousands of different ways by my product's users. When they deliver that message to their friends and their neighbors, their coworkers, to their social circles. And we're beginning, I emphasize beginning, to see the same type of evolution take place in campaign politics also. The idea of a candidate, even in the last weeks of a presidential election, giving a speech in which the country comes together to hear, that doesn't happen very often anymore. So rather that message has to be transmitted from many, many different platforms through many, many different messengers, each to their own cohort, each to their own audience. It is more fractured, and I'd argue that it's messier, but we're learning little by little that centralized communication has both advantages and disadvantages. And trying to communicate as Franklin Roosevelt or Walter Cronkite might have in a social media world isn't going to work. So little by little we're learning what those new tools and techniques are.
Yeah, well, and it certainly was a simpler world, and I think I can even remember, I lived in communities, small communities growing up where there were only 2 television stations. I think ABC was the last one to come
That's
along.
Right.
I actually lived overseas on an island as a teenager, and we had one television that would come on maybe at 5 o'clock in the afternoon if the wind blew out of the southeast and the power wasn't down. And anything that was on the television was about 4 or 5 weeks old because the tapes had to actually be flown out to the island in the Western Pacific. But my point is that when you had 2 or 3 sources, everybody knew Walter Cronkite or Huntley and Brinkley, and I think even President Johnson once upon a time said that when Walter Cronkite came back from his visit to Vietnam, I think it was maybe post-Tet in '68, maybe it was pre-Tet, I think it was post-Tet.
LBJ said, if I've lost Cronkite, I've lost the country.
Yes, exactly. During the days of Walter Cronkite or Huntley or Brinkley, you had a singularity, a point of reference where there was a lot of trust in a single voice. And I think you mentioned about President LBJ after Walter Cronkite came back from a visit to Southeast Asia, Vietnam, during the height of the Vietnam War, and made some comments about we're neither winning or losing. At best, it's a stalemate.
And Johnson's reflection to his advisors was, if we've lost Cronkite, we've lost the country. So trusted was Walter Cronkite's voice, and you're absolutely right. That type of voice just simply doesn't exist in society anymore. It can't.
And therefore, to me, it's unfortunate. Maybe I'm resistant to change here, but there certainly is something powerful about someone who can lead public opinion to a significant extent where we have social consensus. So now we're in a situation where the world is so fragmented. Communications are so fragmented. Everybody is getting their information from multiple different sources. It's even generational where people get their information from. How do we cohere as a society when we don't have a single or a relatively limited number of trusted voices that we can all rely upon to give us social direction?
Well, except under fairly rare circumstances, which I'll discuss in a minute, we won't. Just because we live in a different era with different technology and different tools, just like when you and I were growing up, we lived in a different world than our grandparents had. They probably looked at our world of 2 or 3 television networks and cable TV as being just as challenging a transition for them as people of our generation are facing from the transition we've undergone from broadcast to social media. But back to your question, we're not, except under very rare circumstances, going to have that unifying voice anymore. And that's unfortunate. But once again, as we talked about in the previous episode, there's both downsides and upsides to these changes. You remember when we first talked, I spoke about the benefits of communications technology. And to paraphrase and summarize, in this world, a lot more voices get heard than ever before. So certainly there's a more cohesive conversation in late 20th century America. But it was very limited conversation also. 3 anchor men in New York City and less than a half a dozen news editors in New York and Washington decided what was news and what was not for the country. And one of the things we've learned since then is that while that had somewhat of a unifying effect, it also excluded a lot of relevant information that would have been helpful for us to learn. So on one hand, you don't have that singular voice of authority. On the other hand, you have a wider range of voices and perspectives. And the challenges, as you and I have talked about before, is how do you get people to listen to voices and perspectives that are different, that are different than their own. The challenge for a leader, whether it's a political leader or a business leader or a community leader, and this I think is the core of your question, is how does an individual lead without that platform, without that megaphone? Well, one of the things I teach my students in my leadership class is I teach them that leadership is a team sport. I think what we're learning is whether it's a corporation or a president or any other type of leader, they're going to be forced to rely more and more on the people around them to help them carry out that message. Now, if you think about it, this is not unique in human history. In fact, that's the way that leaders led for most of human history until radio was invented. For most of human history, there was no way for a president or a king or an emperor to communicate with all their subjects, so they relied on others to carry the message out for them. This is obviously the communications tools make it a much faster process, but it's a similar type of challenge. I'd like to add one other thing though, because I think while a lot of it's technology, there are other things that are going on here. One thing that can unify a society more than anything else is an external threat. Call it the Mars attacks school of politics. What can get all the countries of Earth to walk together? Well, when Martians invade, then the Russians and Chinese
We're here to
invade.
help you.
Yes, exactly.
Yes. You and I think like this. I think you and I like the same movies.
I think we do. And the same boxers. But
just to be clear, are you on my father's side on that, or because my father liked Joe Lewis?
oh, no,
I like
you're right
Muhammad
about
Ali.
this. You're absolutely right.
I'm glad to have the support.
Okay. But this is what savvy political leaders do, even absent outer space invasions. The way a savvy leader unifies their constituency is by pointing to an external threat and saying we must all come together to defeat that threat. And we're seeing that right at this moment in Russia, in Ukraine, in Israel, in Taiwan, and plenty of other places around the world where leaders are able to, or in the recent past have been able to, elevate themselves by pointing to a threat that forces people to come together. So we were talking about Cronkite and Huntley and Brinkley earlier. There was a study done in the 1950s by the American Association of Political Scientists. And yes, the organization actually exists, and they have, no offense, the least interesting conventions I've ever attended in my entire life. But the study showed in the 1950s, the biggest concern among political scientists, the best thinkers on these topics in the country, their biggest concern was that there wasn't enough difference between the two parties. And in fact, Americans were being deprived of choices. Now, here in 2024, that seems like sort of a ridiculous concern to have. But let's go back to that concept about external threats. That study was taken less than a decade after the end of World War II. It was taken at the height of the Cold War. And so at that point in time, an Eisenhower Republican and a Truman Democrat weren't that far away from each other, because even if they disagreed on any number of other issues, they recognized the Nazi and the Soviet threats and came together against them. At this particular moment in time, our country at least does not face that kind of existential threat. And I suspect that if we did, you would see our leaders commanding the attention of a broader range of the public than is currently the case. But absent that type of calamity, I think the best leaders are going to be the ones who realize, just the way Caesar and Noah and George Washington and Abraham Lincoln realized, if I want my message to be heard by everyone who needs to hear it, I can't rely just on my own voice. I have to employ a range of other voices on my behalf.
Well, leadership. Let's talk a little bit about you're a professor, scholar on the subject of leadership, and I'm one when I think of classic leaders. Abraham Lincoln is always at the top of my list. And as far as I know, he had no ghost writers. He had no speech writers. He did his own writing. And he understood the difference between the spoken word and the written word. I think even with the Gettysburg Address, there were differences on how he delivered it there in person, and then when he redrafted it for public consumption in the written word. And again, there was no television, no radio, no mass communications, other than to the extent that you can consider, the newspapers to be some type of mass communication. But yet he spoke, and at least for some part of the country at that time, he identified what the war was about, and for another part of the country, he was not only extremely unpopular, he was hated, he was vilified. But yet now in retrospect, he's viewed as he was viewed as the right man. Part of the American genius is we have traditionally been able to elect the right man at the right time, but that is always a historical perspective, because in 1862, I'm sure that half the country didn't agree with that. And maybe for decades after, a good part of the country didn't agree with the election of Abraham Lincoln, but now we do. Leadership. So when we live in a fragmented world that we live in today, again, you have someone with a facility with language, speech, and the written word. Doesn't it make, with today's technology and fragmented world, make it that much harder for someone like an Abraham Lincoln or a Ronald Reagan or someone, FDR, who has a facility with language to get the message out?
It certainly does, at least to get that message out to the entire audience that you're trying to reach. But once again, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, it's trade-offs. On one hand, it's much more difficult for a 21st century leader to command the attention of their entire audience compared to a Reagan, a Roosevelt, and so on. On the other hand, technologically, it's much easier for citizens to access information than ever before. I mean, think about, let's go back to the 19th century. You were talking earlier about how occasionally when you were living on the island, you got news weeks late.
Yes.
That's what the Pony Express did. It delivered news from weeks and weeks earlier because that was the fastest way to get it to the populace. Yeah. So the downside is more people can ignore that news than ever before. But if they want it, it's there faster and easier and more convenient than ever. But once again, it's up to us to decide to take advantage of that opportunity. Quick thing on news traveling slowly. The Battle of New Orleans was fought after the end of the War of 1812. But word just simply hadn't gotten all the way from Washington to Louisiana, so neither side knew it. Not particularly relevant, but it's
Well, it's interesting because it kind of brings to mind Johnny Horton back in 14.
Yes,
we took
exactly.
a road trip longer. I always hear that as Colonel Jackson in the song, but maybe I misheard that.
I think you might have on that one.
Yeah.
But again, back to your question, and I didn't mean to divert from it because it's the right thing to be thinking about. Is a leader today or an aspiring leader today has a different set of tools, which means they have a different set of challenges, but also a different set of opportunities. So in some ways it's harder to collectivize the attention in the audience. On the other hand, it's easier than ever before to reach them. There's a school of thought, talking about great leaders, there's a school of thought that argues that in the nation's entire history, that we've only had 3 truly great presidents: Washington, Lincoln, FDR. That's it. There are those who'd make the case for Reagan, for Teddy Roosevelt, for Thomas Jefferson. There's others who enter the conversation. But the school of thought is these are the 3 who at the time when the country most needed them stepped forward. And what I find is that aside from everything else, they arrived at roughly equidistant times in American history from each other. Washington presidency in the very tail end of the 18th century, Lincoln's in the middle of the 19th century, Roosevelt's in the early portion of the 20th century.
That means we're due.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth. We're just about due.
Which raises the question, again, traditionally it's been a unique American characteristics to elect the right person in retrospect the right time. Do you think we still have that talent?
I think we do. And I'll believe that until it's proven wrong. And hardline partisans on both sides will argue that it already has because someone from the party that they don't like has gotten elected. Right. But I do believe that that's still in us. But just because that capability still exists within us doesn't mean we'll necessarily take advantage of that capability. Just because we can do the right thing doesn't mean we necessarily will. And to me, that's the challenge, less of the leader and more of the country. We talked the first time we did this program. We talked about the divisions in society. And I talked to you about tribalism. Well, for the first 200 years, roughly, of American history, the most significant tribe in the United States of America was the tribe of the United States of America. We went to school, we learned about the nation's history, and in some ways we learned it in an over-idealistic way. But on the other hand, we learned at an early age how important it was for us to maintain our membership in this tribe of the United States. And that's a much bigger challenge now, because on one hand, you do want to teach both the good and the bad of history, but what we've also done is we made it harder for the youngest generations to identify themselves as part of a national tribe, and more likely to identify themselves as part of a smaller and more distinct one. And again, everyone deserves the benefits of their heritage and their identity, but you also want a society where people can not honor each other's differences, but when necessary, put them aside in order to work together as one. And when our tribes are smaller than they once were, that's more individually empowering, but it's a lot harder to work together collectively. So this is something I worry about, and that we haven't been put to this test yet. So while I do think, to answer your question, that we do have the capability to continue to select that right man or woman at the right time, that doesn't mean just because we have that capability doesn't mean we'll always correctly exercise it.
Well, which is a profound question, isn't it? Because if we have lost that talent, I, for one, don't want to look down the road to see what that foretells. Because if we have lost the ability to elect the right person at the right time, then it doesn't bode well for the future of the country.
Agreed. And then the question becomes, rather than simply throwing up our hands, say, how do we get that back? Most doors are two-way doors. If you walk through them, you can walk back through. And if somewhere along the way we have lost, or if we do lose our way and sacrifice that capability, my initial instinct isn't, woe is us. My first thought is, we know how to do this. We've done it before. How can we get back to it?
Well, it raises the question, to me, there's a difference between leaders and leadership. A lot of people end up in positions of leadership who aren't naturally leaders or good at it. And history is replete with, all sorts of examples. We've elected leaders, in the past that weren't particularly good, and then we've had some that have been superb. You've mentioned 3 today. But leadership, in my mind, is different just being a leader. To me, leadership is someone that can lead by power of persuasion and ideals, and bring us with them, as opposed to someone who's just checking the latest polls this morning. Okay, 52% of the people believe X, so therefore I agree with X too. That's a follower, not a leader. Where have all the good leaders gone? Or are they just hiding in plain sight?
I'll tell you where they're not as much as they used to be. While I think there are still some really good and decent and admirable men and women in politics, I think fewer and fewer, and this is something I see on the campuses where I teach, fewer and fewer of those young people with truly exceptional leadership skills and capabilities choose public service as the foundation from which to exercise that leadership.
Could you define public service?
Politics, government, et cetera.
Oh, fewer.
Yeah. Because the best of these young people, those who might have run for office in the future because of their leadership skills and capabilities, because we hold politics in such low regard these days, I think if I have the potential to make a difference, maybe I'd rather make it in the private sector or the nonprofit sector than the public sector. So those leaders are there, but we are seeing more and more of them choosing paths other than politics and elective office. And that is a real challenge, and that's something that deeply concerns me.
Well, in a very real sense, you don't blame them because it's such a blood sport. But then politics really has been a blood sport, and kind of lay a little bit of a foundation for my question, because even in George Washington's day, the opposition press I don't know if they call it opposition press, but a lot of stuff that Thomas Jefferson was secretly supporting that was very antagonistic to Washington's administration or points of view. It was very hostile.
Oh my gosh, the type of things that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were saying about each other would make Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump blush with embarrassment. So you're right, this has been part of politics for as long as there's been politics.
But yet we still produce these very talented people that would get into the Senate, run for the White House and so forth, and now people are not willing to do that to the same extent. So in terms of being the blood sport, it's always been a blood sport. But is there something different about the nature of the blood sport now that is intimidating or frightening good leaders away from ever getting into the fight?
So partisanship and polarization has always led to that kind of really fierce political fighting. You're exactly right, that's nothing new. But because, as we talked about in our first conversation, because that partisanship has gotten so intense, the polarization has gotten so much greater, it's become so much harder to get anything done. And so what that aspiring leader thinks is, I'm willing to deal with the slings and arrows. I'm willing to deal with the curses and the anger if I can get something done by overcoming that. But why in the world would I deal with all that invective if we're still not going to get anything done? Right. So, yeah, would making politics more civil help? Maybe a little bit, but would help a lot more is making politics more productive, so that those leaders would say, I can handle the insults, I can handle the onslaught, because I know if I persevere, I'm going to get something done. And fewer young people have the confidence that the public square is where that can happen anymore.
I read somewhere that the slur against George Washington that upset him beyond all others was that someone called him a horse whipper, not a whisperer, but a horse whipper. And of course, Washington was famously, arguably, the best horseman in the country at the time. And supposedly 2 or 3 days later, he was still so upset he couldn't calm down, and his staff had to say, Mr. President, you got to settle down. We got business to do here. But he was still upset, and I still don't know what horse whipper means. I thought maybe it had some type of metaphorical reference more than just whipping a horse. But I've always wondered about that.
So look, those insults, that ugliness, has always been a part of politics. But our best leaders have been willing to withstand it in the interest of accomplishing important goals. And now the question that a young person asks is, even if I withstand all those attacks, can I still accomplish these goals? And more, not just young people, but we see it in congressional retirements.
Right.
Members saying,
they've had enough.
And not because it's mean-spirited, but because we're not getting anything done.
Right, right. Well, but we have been through this before, have we not? Because you look at the politics of the 1840s, 1850s, we couldn't even agree on where to put the Transcontinental Railroad because of the Southern Bloc and the Northern Bloc, and it was only when the Southern states succeeded that suddenly had the majority to decide that the Transcontinental Railroad would be the northern, well, not the real northern route, but the central route. So we had that, we can't do stuff before. And unfortunately, this is the scary part, is that had we get through that, it cost us a civil war. And so that raises the question, are we heading that way? A lot of people talk about this. Are we getting ourselves politically where we can't get anything done? Are we pushing ourselves into the threat of a civil war that's going to resolve it one way or the other so that we can be productive in the future?
Well, the 1840s and 1850s were one example of that kind of divisiveness and hatred. But it's not the only one. In the 19-teens, just after World War I, right before World War I, there were 75 members of the U.S. House of Representatives who were publicly declared members of the Ku Klux Klan. 75 House members, who weren't just members, but who felt comfortable.
Well, they declared it themselves.
Yes, exactly. And this is the time when the movie Birth of a Nation came out.
Right.
Sort of
supposedly President Wilson's favorite movie.
Precisely. The 1960s, we talk about how there might be protests in Chicago this summer against Biden because of the war in Gaza. Well, I've read that some of the protesters in Chicago in 1968 were prepared to put LSD in the city's water supply. They were so determined to stop the proceedings. So there's a wonderful book by the historian John Meacham called The Soul of America, before Biden appropriated the term. And this is the basic premise of his book, which is we have faced these types of divisions throughout our country's entire history, even before we were a country. And we've gotten through them before. Now, when I first heard about the book, I thought, okay, I should probably read this because it's good beats evil, Luke beats Darth, it's the circle of life, I should read this. Right. The book's better than that because what it demonstrates, including the post-Civil War era, is it demonstrates how we overcame those divisions in the past. Sometimes it required war, sometimes it required depression, sometimes it required some other type of upheaval or external threat. But his main point is we have overcome, this is not as unique a time as we think it is. And we have overcome these kind of challenges before. A variation on what we discussed earlier. Just because we have overcome them when we faced them before doesn't guarantee that we will this time. Right. But it means that we can. And maybe to our earlier point, maybe we need to relearn some lessons that we've forgotten. But we have demonstrated in the past as a country our ability to overcome these types of divisions in the past, which makes me believe that while there's no guarantee, that we're perfectly capable of doing so again in the future.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned that because we've recovered from these episodes in the past, but to know how we recovered from those episodes and overcame them requires education. And we live in an era of cancel culture. And my wife and I were in Paris about a year ago, and the Parisian we were talking to, very interested, and I asked him, have you heard about the cancel culture environment in the United States? And he said, no, I haven't heard about that. And so I explained a little bit about what it was, and he looked at me and said, well, every country has something to be embarrassed about. Why do you want to erase it from memory? You know, it's kind of like, who's the Egyptian pharaoh as Walter or Chuck Heston was marching out, says erase from all the obelisks, so let it be written, so let it be done. I guess maybe that's the first example of cancel culture. But the challenge, though, if that we're not educating ourselves about our past, and so that we don't learn how our ancestors overcame similar challenges, are we basically at a point where we are destroying ourselves if we don't admit our past and our mistakes in our past and live up to them?
Those who fail to learn the lessons of the past are condemned to repeat it, absolutely. Right. I'm part of a group called the Coalition for Civics Education in California. And to me, the work we have tried to do speaks directly to the point that you're raising. Right. Most California public schools require their students to take one single semester of civics education before they graduate from high school. And it's actually, most of the time, it's one single semester of civics and government and geography, all crammed together in 11th or 12th grade. And if you think about it, the lesson we're teaching our young people, unintentionally, is that this government stuff, this politics stuff, this democracy stuff is so unimportant. We're not going to bother teaching it to you. We're not going to bother talking to you at all for your first 10 years of education. Then we're going to give you this one 15-week crash course. And then we want you to turn around 18 months later and magically be responsible citizens and regular voters. And toward your point, that's not enough education. Whether it's history, whether it's government, whether it's civics, it's not enough time and effort to make sure our young people understand what's expected of them and available to them as members of a community. The original reason, the original rationale for public education in this country was not reading or writing arithmetic. The original rationale for public schools was civics education. And the fact that we've lost that, I think more than anything else, has driven the kind of divisions and misunderstandings that you and I have been talking about.
Well, it also seems that it's even more important, let's talk about California again as an example where it's an extremely diverse community, but yet if we have limited education in civics, all those individuals who are recent arrivals, how do they assimilate our sense of democracy, the sense of the Republican government that has served us so well for 240, 250 years now?
Well, and I would argue that both for new arrivals and for children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren of American citizens, the knowledge is critically important. Because if you don't understand your place in this country, you're much more likely to look for a smaller and a less representative tribe. Right. The better you understand the American tribe, the more likely you are to want to try to be part of it. And there's always going to be those who reject it, and that's their prerogative. but you're a lot less likely to reject something if you understand it.
Well, I want to circle back also to a point that where have all the good leaders gone, or are they just hiding in plain sight? I think venture a observation on behalf of our listeners and maybe a broad swath of the Americans as a whole is that we're questioning the quality of the leaders that we have representing us. I think you've already made a comment a few moments ago. Well, maybe they're there, they're just hiding in plain sight. They just don't want to get into the game because of the viciousness associated with it, and maybe more important, as you said, because what's the point? I can't do anything because nothing gets done. Isn't that an existential threat to this country, that we're not producing the people that can lead us to a better future?
I think it's a critically important challenge, and I would define it just a little bit different. Define it just a little bit differently. I think we are producing those people. We're simply not giving them the platform from which they can lead. And fixing a broken politics, making it less polarizing, making society less divisive, is going to give those young people with the leadership skills and capabilities a realistic chance of accomplishing those leadership goals. John Boehner, when he was Speaker of the House, had a great line. He said, "A leader without followers is just a guy out for a walk."
I love it.
So we can train these young men and women to become leaders. But I think we also have to understand as a society the benefits of working together as part of a leadership effort. Mm-hmm. And the more divided we are, definitionally, therefore, the harder it becomes for a leader to unify us. But we have to be willing to be led. We have to be willing to unify in order for an effective leader to take us forward.
Well, Professor, we're almost out of time for this episode, but we'd love to have you back for another time. But let me ask you for the final question, the recipe. In order, this is a broad question, feel free to attack it from any angle you would like to attack, but how do we get all those talented leaders who don't want to be in the game back into the game?
Boy, it's a great question. And I think I think there's two different ways to look at this, both of equal importance. One is, quote, the game itself has to be improved. In other words, we have to begin as a society to be willing to try to bridge these divisions in politics or elsewhere in order for those potential leaders to be able to step forward. So some of that responsibility is on us. I also think that the best way to prepare an individual for leadership, as counterintuitive as it may sound, is to teach them humility. One of the things I spend more time than any other talking to students about, particularly those who have really impressive leadership potential, that I said, you have learned throughout 15, 16 years of school, elementary school, secondary school, now college, you've learned that it's important to be good at everything. That's exactly wrong. Now, in high school, that's what we want from them. When they apply to college, they need to get good grades, they need to play an instrument, they need to play a sport, they need to volunteer. I said, we're going to change the rules on you as soon as you graduate from college. Instead of trying to be good at everything, we only want you to be really, really good at one thing. I have a heart surgeon. I don't care if he plays the tuba. I want him to be a really good heart surgeon. It doesn't really matter anymore. And so this gets back to a point I made you earlier, is to help them understand that leadership is a team sport. And no individual, no matter how brilliant, no matter how devoted, no matter how impassioned, can lead effectively themselves. And the best leaders are the best team builders. The best leaders are the best coalition builders. And in order to do that effectively, a leader needs to have humility. A leader needs to understand both what they're good at and what they're not good at. And have the self-awareness to say, there are certain things I'm not good at. My job isn't to get good at them. My job is to put together a team full of people who are good at the things that I'm not. It's a great quote. I wish I could remember who said it. As a leader, I just don't remember who it was. I'm embarrassed. He said, I never want to be the smartest person in any room that I'm in. And the best leaders are those who understand that if they're going to succeed, They have to recruit people who are as good or better than them at things. And in a highly individualistic society, I'm not sure that that's the lesson that we're teaching our prospective young leaders.
Well, those are words of wisdom for the ages, Professor, and well said. We would love to have you back for another episode.
I would really enjoy it, so thank you.
Well, wonderful. Once again, my name is Roger Clark. My esteemed guest today is Professor Dan Schnur, professor at Pepperdine, the USC, and also at University of California in Berkeley. If you've liked the episode today, be sure and like us. We'd appreciate any comments and observations that you might have. Please stay tuned. We will be back with Professor Schnur for another episode. Once again, the 4 Score and 7 Project. I'm Roger Clark. Thank you for listening.